Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this roundtable at the Center for Post-Christendom Studies. This is the second segment in our interview with Kevin Makins, who I'm glad to have as my guest here today. Kevin is a pastor at the Eucharist Church in Hamilton, Ontario, and the author of the book, Why Would Anyone Go to Church? With Baker Publishing. And we're glad to continue our conversation with Kevin and kind of just pick it up sort of in the same place where we left off at the end of our last conversation, where we were talking about church relating to this post-Christian culture and some of the challenges are in that. So let's back up a little bit, though. So about 10 years ago, you, through some circumstances, decided that you were going to be a part of planting this church in the city of Hamilton, and talk a little bit about what was the impetus behind that, and maybe a little bit about how that has evolved. I know that's a big story, and a lot of it is told in the book, but maybe you can sort of just give us sort of some of the thumbnail of kind of what it's been like to try and plant a church.
I think for me, planting a church came out of this love of two things. One, a love of the tradition of the Christian faith, a love of God, a love of what God was doing in the world, and of the church, like learning to love the church in particular. But I never wanted to be a pastor, because pastoring a church didn't really seem interesting. But I also loved a place. I loved downtown Hamilton. And that was probably the place, kind of the intersection where this started to happen, was I loved Hamilton. I wanted to know, what does the city need? How do we serve it? And to use sort of Christian language, what would it look like for God's kingdom to further be revealed in downtown Hamilton? And so I talked to other churches and saw what they were doing, and they were doing all these great things, like beautiful things. But there was a group of people that I knew in this city, artists, people on the edge of faith, people that were just kind of didn't fit neatly in church boxes, who for some reason or another couldn't really connect with that kind of church, or people that maybe were raised in a church that they didn't feel like they could connect with, and they were on their way out, and maybe there was a chance for them to engage, that they weren't maybe rejecting the Christian faith or the way of Jesus, but they were rejecting things they saw in the church that they perceived to be not the way Jesus would want things to be. Right. And so kind of reflecting on that intersection eventually led to this realization when I heard about church planting, because I didn't know it existed. I was raised Lutheran. I thought we planted them all 500 years ago and we're done. But it was like, people start churches? Like, I didn't even know you could do that. That's allowed? And so that led to this journey of gathering with friends and meeting people downtown. And my wife and I just lived here for 2 years and met people, and we talked about this, and I was working at a church in Toronto trying to learn what does it look like to plant a church in a city, and eventually realized, we've got like 15, 20 people. I think we could be a church, and I think that a kind of church that we are dreaming of would be helpful to the city, would bless the city. It would be helpful for the church, would actually bring about more diversity in the body of Christ, a different part of the body that could be a different expression. And so that's kind of where we began. And that journey then led to, this core group forming, and then the slow evolution over a decade of what is now the congregation that we're a part of.
Now, just as part of along the way in the journey, and you tell a great story in the book, but you can maybe just touch on it. You went to a church planting conference or a seminar.
An assessment
seminar. Now, you'd already been in a few years. The church was pretty much already established.
It was kind of going.
But the denomination you're connected with thought it would be good for you to maybe go and partake in this assessment.
In their defense, they wanted to know, is this a good assessment center? So I don't want to throw them under the bus. They weren't sending us.
Yeah.
They were saying, hey, this might be a good tool. So maybe you can go and get assessed as you guys are, and we'll kind of we'll assess the assessment center.
And it didn't go so well for you.
No, it wasn't great. We went, and it was out in Vancouver. It was this very, very kind of traditional evangelical, large machine, predictable structures. The first hint that things might not go the way that we thought they would is when they wouldn't accept any of the female assessors or church planters. So there was a sense of which, this is not necessarily a fit with our congregation where women are involved at every level of leadership. But I'll play ball with anyone. I'll eat whatever meals put before me. I don't want to judge them for where they are, even though I disagree. So we kind of had this attitude, we're going to go and we're just going to be ourselves as best we can. Try to share what God's doing in our lives, what God's doing in this church. And, I had this thought of it's one thing for people that like you and know you to see God working. But if people that don't know you and don't necessarily agree with you, if they can see, though, that God's doing something here, that would be so validating. It would really be encouraging. So we went with this attitude of, they're not going to give us 10 out of 10, but they're probably going to hopefully they'll see what God's doing, and that'll be encouraging to us
Right.
as we were kind of in this difficult season as a church. And no, that we got an F.
Yeah.
We got a straight fail, and we were already 5 years into a church. I had to come back and tell everyone this was never meant to exist. I don't know. And so that was a real tension, was this kind of some of the gatekeepers of church planting who then said to us, no, you are not a valid part of the body of Christ. You are not meant to be a part of what God's doing in Canada, in your city.
And of course, I wasn't there. I don't know, the organization or the issue, how they conducted their assessment workshop, but perhaps it's an indication of how things are changing so drastically in terms of of church and planting a church, and how ways we conceived of it in decades past is just no longer. And what you guys were doing was valid and important, even though it was completely dismissed as of being such by an established church planting assessment.
And I don't want to throw them under the bus, because whatever they're doing is working for them, presumably. But it's, I was talking with you earlier about the idea of film studios. If you watch film, for a long time, film studios, they existed in a certain way. They had large donor bases. They had long established trajectories. They had key leaders that had to be appeased at every level. And so the movies that were coming out were kind of predictable. Maybe there's a couple of changes, but they were pretty much the same kind of thing. And then we had this renaissance, maybe 20 years ago, maybe longer. I'm not a film buff, but we had this renaissance of indie film studios who said, no, what we're doing is 1/10 of the budget. It doesn't have all the hierarchy. It doesn't have all the tradition of your main distributors, but we are film, and we are going to make film that now is celebrated and winning awards, Academy Awards, not because the traditional market was bad, but because it was limited. The imagination of it was limited because they said, this is how films have to look. These are the stories they have to tell. And that meant that stories by underrepresented directors and writers weren't being told, and it turns out they're great stories that will be celebrated when they have a chance to tell their story. And I feel like in some ways, our church was kind of an indie film studio saying, we've got something. We're not saying it's the only kind of film. We're not saying that every other kind of film is busted. But we're saying these films all tend to look a certain way. Nothing wrong with that, but maybe there's a need for other kinds of stories. What really kills me, though, about that assessment center is that I went in with all the privilege in the world. I'm white. I'm a man. I'm a bit of like an alpha male-y. I mean, not like a real alpha, but like I'm confident and I'm loud. I have a master's of divinity, and we had already started a church. And I still felt wounded after the failure. And so if that's how I feel, I can't help but think, what would somebody who was single there? Like I'm married, and I checked every box. How would somebody who's not the charismatic personality type, how would a woman feel receiving that failure? How would a person of color or an indigenous Christian feel if they were being pushed away? And so, or a queer voice, like all of these different parts, these are people in the body of Christ for whom we need to allow these expressions to be a part of the wider body of Christ. And if they got this firm no, I have enough privilege and ego to push my way through. And enough wise voices around me that were able to bring that encouragement. But how many churches are we missing out there? How many tiny indie studios are not being the congregations God's called them to be because the gatekeepers closed the door and they didn't have all the other privilege that maybe allows them to push through?
So that, let me ask you then, what would you say to maybe somebody who's watching and is thinking about, I'd love to make an independent movie, i.e. Plant a new expression of church in my community, the place that I love. What would you say to someone? How would you want to inspire or encourage them?
I mean, I don't want to say that there's no need for networks. We're part of a denomination. We're part of a local church network. So it's not saying like just go do your own thing. Any indie studio is going to need to have the right relationships to be able to make what they're called to make. Be orthodox. Like, I'm not talking about going off and just doing your own crazy thing. But I would say that sometimes the people who say they're the gatekeepers, or they say they're the coalition, and again, nothing negative about it, but they say, no, we are the ones who decide. And I'd say, look, no, you have an important part in the body of Christ, but there are other people that also have important parts. So maybe you don't need the permission of the gatekeepers you think you need permission from. Maybe there are different denominations, different networks that can hold you, keep you accountable, help you discern. but are not going to push you away just because you don't fit in the pre-existing, they're used to looking at hands and assessing hands. Maybe you're a foot. You're not going to be noticed by that. They're going to think you're a weird-looking hand.
Yeah.
There might be other parts of the body. So talk to different denominations, talk to different networks, talk to different pastors locally. Find someone who can say, we see what God's doing here. Because there will be someone who sees what God is doing. And then from that place, start building out the relationships you're going to need to sustain a local congregation, because it's not easy. And then also, don't expect your local congregation, if you're not going through those traditional gatekeepers, don't expect you're going to get the privileges and benefits of some of those traditional spaces.
Yeah.
So you might not have a large budget. You might not have a hired staff. You might not have a building of your own. You might not have a lot of what institutional Christianity has had, but it does not mean you're not a valid part of the body of Christ. You might just need to shift your imagination, be bivocational, think about meeting in different spaces, think about different structures of leadership. But if you have those good mentors, voices, networks around you, they will contextually help you discern at every stop what is the next faithful thing to do. And hopefully, in a decade or so, you'll be able to say, wow, we not only have survived, but we are now going to be outposts for other congregations that God is summoning up from the dirt, growing up, and we can become some of that support that maybe we wish we had earlier in our story.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that you chronicle in the book quite well, is you point out people as well as tell stories about the people who did those very things for you.
Totally.
And were really important in your and the church's development.
Yeah,
and
without good
ability
mentors, we'd be a tire.
survive.
I was 23 when we started this. We'd be a tire fire.
Yeah.
But good mentors, good wisdom, good networks, always vital for congregations to be healthy.
So this is maybe a question I should have asked at the beginning, but I want to just circle back and ask it, because it kind of touches on what we were just talking about what you would say to church planters. But who would you say this book is for? Who do you hope would read this book, Kev?
Yeah, I think this book is for two kinds of people. I'd say overall it's for people that find themselves on the edge of the Christian faith in some way or another. That might be the edge of the inside. So you love the church, you love Jesus, you're Orthodox, all that kind of stuff. But there's something about the church you go, look, I don't hate it, I'm not rebelling against it, but there are things that we could do differently. I find myself feeling like I'm on the edge of that. I go to spaces and I go, like the big institutional things, and I go, yeah, I want to see something different. I'd say it's for people on the edge of the inside who want to see a different kind of congregation, a different kind of church imagination. And maybe they want to start that, or maybe they're in a traditional church, but they want to be the kind of edge person within that community for the good of that community. And I'd say it's also for people on the edge of the outside who feel like they've maybe walked away from the church or grown a little cynical or a little skeptical, and they would like to re-engage with community, with a spiritual community, but they don't really know what that would look like. And I hope this book kind of cracks the door open for them to say, you can actually hang it on this edge. You'll be right next to the people on the edge of the inside, but that those two groups need each other. And when those two groups connect, God does beautiful things in that space. And that then is good for those far away from the church, because it creates new kinds of communities that are beautiful witnesses and cities on a hill. But it also revitalizes the life of the rest of the church, because we are better for the richer kind of ecosystem that is created when different congregations exist in unity and in relationship.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I would just reiterate that. I think that the book, if I can really say, I think it connects with those audiences. I think it's a book that finds this nice balance between being theologically rich and thoughtful, biblically rooted. It's a book that would be for people who are seeking faith, or again have been maybe disengaged from church community, but still are open to that and maybe want to give church a second chance. And then also it's a book that would be great for church planters.
Yeah, and I hope it's fun to read. I hope people laugh when they read it, because the last thing you want is another dry book about theology. It's
an honest assessment of church and what it means to try and be a church that is connected to its place and its culture in a post-Christian environment. So the book, again, is Why Would Anyone Go to Church? The author is Kevin Makins. He's been our guest here on the round table. And thanks for Kevin for doing this. And thanks to you for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next round table.